I'm just trying to see if I can draw a few people in there at the time, but I think in the sort of interest of timing and schedule, we should get on to this final session where we're going to hear from Hayden McRobbie, Rebecca McKetin, and Don Weatherburn. I'll start off introducing Hayden McRobbie, who's going to talk about the future of vaping and e-cigarettes. I'm sure he needs no introduction. I'm not going to give voluminous biographies for people. Hayden.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks, everyone. Yes, no introductions needed. And I'm going to try and get through quite a number of slides here because, as you will all be aware, this is quite topical at the moment in terms of the vaping-related or associated, I should say, lung illnesses in the US. Now, just to start off and to refresh your memory, you know this anyway, that it's smoking that causes the harm. It's the products of combustion, not so much the nicotine itself. And when we talk about harm reduction in this area, we're really talking about ongoing nicotine use, as opposed to just reducing the number of cigarettes smoked per day. Remember, to get the greatest health benefits, there needs to be complete cessation from tobacco. For some people, that's going to take some weeks to months, perhaps, to get to, but that's the goal. Now, in terms when we talk about e-cigarettes or vaping, and I'll use these terms interchangeably, there's not one product, and you've seen over time that things have changed. Now, I first started looking at these vaping products or e-cigarettes back in 2007, so 12 years ago now. And at the time, I remember these products were more like your cigarette holders. They were quite long, they were quite heavy, and the participants that were testing these would complain of jaw ache because they're trying to hold these things in their mouths, and they're rather bottom heavy and sort of droop. They weren't very good at the time either, and their nicotine delivery system was just a sponge with the nicotine solution in, and I remember changing these cartridges, and my desk was covered with an oily sort of solution of nicotine and the propylene glycol. But it's moved on quite a bit now, and the most recent products to the market, if you like, are these pod-like devices shown there on the right of the screen, so-called fourth generation or pod devices. They all have some things in common, though. They all contain a battery, they all contain a heating element, or an atomizer, it's commonly called, but it essentially aerosolizes the liquid. And the components of the products are typically propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, and nicotine, so all water-soluble products. The technology is continuing to evolve, and I think we'll see some more innovation in time to come. Well, unless they're all banned, of course. Now, so this just past few days, this was a Lancet editorial published on the 12th of October. And I'm just going to pull out a few things in this editorial, which I'm going to talk about. And one, it talks about the US outbreak of lung injury associated with e-cigarette use. And I guess here that perhaps driving the anxiety around this is that most of these people were younger people. But also most were vaping THC as well. So that we're not really talking about the e-liquid that people have vaped for years and years. This is something a little bit different. And we still haven't got to the bottom of exactly what caused this. The editorial also talks about weak evidence for claims that e-cigarettes may help people stop smoking and that they're safer than smoking. Now, I put question marks there. I don't think it's quite as weak as this editorial was implying, but you can make up your own mind. They went on to say that any benefit of vaping in terms of a harm reduction tool may be undermined by the high uptake in young people, and that's another question. And flavours are often cited for why young people are starting to vape. You've got some countries banning them, most recently India joining the list there, some states in the US also thinking about banning flavours, although there's some challenge around that. And then you've got in England that Public Health continue to endorse vaping as something that's less harmful than smoking and may help people quit. This is what the editorial had at the end of it. Surely it's time to align the public health approach to e-cigarettes with that of cigarettes. I don't know where you stand on this. I put in my conflict of interest statement at the beginning that I'm clearly on the probably still the green thumbs up, although even my opinions changed over time. So let's start with the situation in the USA, because I think that's what we're all worried about. And indeed, it's been rather unfortunate to see so many cases, and this was the update from the 8th of October. It's predicted to carry on increasing. But you've got around 1,300 cases of severe lung injury with 26 deaths. Again, as I said at the beginning, most of these cases are associated with the use of THC-containing products as opposed to just the regular vaping products with nicotine in. Remember that e-cigarettes or vaping products are just a tool or a device, much like needles are. It doesn't mean that it's what you put in it that really matters, and I think we've got to just keep that in mind. And just for some context in all of this, because we mustn't lose sight of what we're trying to battle here, and that in the USA, around 1,300 people die every day of a smoking-related illness. And if you're looking at opioid overdoses, it's around 130 deaths per day. So this is obviously over a 2 to 3 month period. When we're trying to work out what's going on here in these lung injuries, we're still not exactly sure. We know that these people have suffered respiratory symptoms. There were some gastrointestinal symptoms that appeared before these. Fever, tachycardia have been reported in some people. Blood tests are sort of non-specific markers of inflammation. And leukocytosis, mostly neutrophils. Histopathology, again, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. There are some evidence of lipid-filled macrophages which might suggest lipoid pneumonia type responses, but then there are other signs that suggest more a sort of toxic lung injury with pneumonitis. We're probably not going to know for some time here. The CDC and the FDA have been criticised a little bit in being slow to give some clear messages to the public, but this is what they're recommending now, is that you don't use vaping products containing THC, especially those that you purchase off the street or on the black market, and not to modify or add any other substances. I think this is partly where things have gone wrong, is that we haven't really been clear in our communication about what people should stay away from in vaping. It's almost perhaps that we've just ignored it. Okay, I want to move on to the weak evidence for smoking cessation. And look, to be honest, initially it has been weak. These are the data from the Cochrane Review, which we last updated in 2016, when there were only 2 trials. Now, both of these trials compare nicotine-containing vaping products with non-nicotine vaping products, and both of them showed that those with nicotine in were more likely to help people quit for at least 6 months than those without. Now, that shouldn't be surprising. If smokers smoke for nicotine, then replacing the nicotine in a different way should indeed help them quit smoking. But I think you can all agree that the overall quit rates there, 9% versus 4%, are pretty modest on the grand scheme of things. Now, in Cochrane, because there are 2 studies, we had to overall rate this evidence as weak. But there are more data emerging. This is a study that I've been involved in, and actually this study we put in for grant funding 3 times before it finally got funded. I remember it very well, the first time when people thought that vaping products were just a fad, they'd never ever catch on. But anyway, finally got it funded, and this was conducted in the UK Stop Smoking Services, and it compared nicotine-containing e-cigarette versus nicotine replacement therapy, so standard treatment. Most people in the NRT arm use combination therapy, so patch and gum or patch and lozenge, which is more effective than single product. Now, the data you're seeing here on the screen are 1-year continuous abstinence rates, biochemically validated. Again, this is not a magic cure, but you did see a rough doubling in the chances of long-term abstinence with e-cigarettes versus NRT. A New Zealand study published earlier this month, in September, a little bit more complex in what it was testing, but if you just look at the top table there, which is looking at patches plus nicotine containing e-cigarettes versus patches and a no or zero nicotine e-cigarette. Again, you see this same pattern emerging where e-cigarettes with nicotine in do better than those without. The CO verified abstinence rate's pretty low there. This was a study essentially done online with very little support. So unlike the UK study where there were face-to-face support and guidance, this was not quite the same. You can see the difference there in self-reported versus continuous abstinence rate. Quite a big gap here. So the investigators found it quite difficult to get people back in. But regardless of that, there is still a significant difference between these two arms. And just to mention a couple of other studies here. This was a feasibility study, and they gave people either an e-cigarette product or general brief advice and recommendation to go and seek help from stop smoking services. These are people with periodontal disease, and the 6-month follow-up abstinence rates there are 15% in those that had a nicotine-containing e-cigarette given to them versus 5% in the control group. So again, a similar pattern emerging. One randomised control trial that didn't show any effect, and I'll just mention this there, and I guess this was a pragmatic trial where they took a whole lot of employees from 54 companies and they used this opt-out approach. So to not be included in the study, you had to contact the researchers and say, I don't want to be, and then they just sent them or allocated them to one of 5 different arms here. One was usual care, one was free smoking cessation medicines, so NRT, bupropion, varenicline, and then if that didn't work, they could still request an e-cigarette. E-cigarette arm was an Enjoy product, between 10 and 15 milligrams per mil used there, then a financial incentive, and then a financial incentive which was actually a deposit paid. So it was a little bit complex, and these were the results. Overall, really very, very low quit rates, 1.3% on an intention to treat basis. Now, this doesn't surprise me when you just go out to a whole lot of people and say, here are some things, good luck. It's very different from studies where you're recruiting people that are motivated to quit. In this trial, it was really only the financial rewards that had the effect. Neither the free stop smoking medications or e-cigarettes had any effect in this study. Now, I just want to reflect back on nicotine replacement therapy here. And this has always been the gold standard for quite some time. And of course, NRT simply works by providing some of the nicotine that people would have otherwise got from their tobacco smoke. But unlike tobacco smoke, which gives you a big hit of nicotine very quickly, and this is why smoking is so dependence producing, your best NRT products give half the peak that you get with smoking and take a long time to reach that peak. You can see there with 4 milligram gum, it's around 30 minutes or so. So yes, they do provide some of the nicotine, but much slower. And also here, the quit rates are quite modest as well. These data from the Cochrane review, if you just look overall at these products, you're up around maybe 16, 17% in an active treatment versus 10% in placebo. So no magic cures, but this is the same across the board with smoking. And just to give you a little bit of real-world evidence here as well, these data are from the UK, the Smoking Toolkit study, and this is in a group of people that actually made a quit attempt in the last 6 months, and they were asked about what they used in that quit attempt, and then they looked at whether they were smoking or not. And once they adjusted for all a number of covariates and their smoking cessation aids, there were only 2 things that came out positive. Those that used e-cigarettes or those that used varenicline were more likely to quit smoking than those that did not use them. So there are some data. It's still fairly thin on the ground, I suppose, on the grand scheme of things. But we've got 4 quite good clinical trials so far that are all showing a similar pattern, but still no magic cure. Okay, just on the issue of are e-cigarettes less harmful than smoking? And I prefer to say less harmful than safer. I think some families hear safer and think safe. I do worry in young people that are starting to experiment that families think, oh yeah, that's safer or that's safe, when actually they should be saying, no, if you don't smoke, these products are not for you. So are they less harmful? Well, I think there's still agreement that they actually are less harmful. Exactly how much less harmful than smoking, we haven't quite got that yet. This is a quote from the NASEM report from the US. And they say, well, look, they're not without harm, but they're apparently less risky and severe than using combustible tobacco. So I sort of translate to that diagram there on the right of the screen that the harm depends on where you're coming from. If you're a current smoker that switches completely to vaping, then you're likely to have a reduction in health harm. If you're someone that doesn't smoke and you start vaping, then obviously you're likely to have some increase in harm. Just don't know how much yet and how long that will take to emerge. And we do know that there are substances, of course, in these products that are potentially harmful. I don't think there's any denying that. When you heat vegetable glycerin to high levels, you can get aldehydes forming. And we've seen that. Vapors typically notice this as a bit of an acrid taste, and so don't do it. But it is possible to superheat your e-liquid and burn it and produce these aldehydes, which are carcinogenic. As with anything from nicotine that's produced from tobacco, there are tobacco-specific nitrosamines present. This is the same with NRT. There are tobacco-specific nitrosamines present in your nicotine patch, but that are at tiny, tiny levels that are unlikely to cause any sort of harm whatsoever. There are metals in the coils, of course, the batteries, the other components that can appear in the vapor. And then in the liquid itself, you've got nicotine, and then the flavorings. Now, the flavorings are probably going to be the things that might cause some harm. We already have an idea that some of these, like benzaldehyde, which gives a cherry flavor, may be toxic to the respiratory system. The similar sort of response with cinnamaldehydes and diacetyl, which you've probably all heard about in popcorn lung. In terms of nicotine use and its particular risks, the current evidence does not support the idea that nicotine is a carcinogen. I know there are animal studies and some recent data as well that suggest that it might have a role to play, but we've got good human data here from often very long-term use with nicotine replacement therapy and some of the other non-combustible tobacco products which can deliver high nicotine without the harm. In terms of cardiovascular disease, in some animal studies again, and in some human studies, it suggests that nicotine may have a role to play in people with underlying cardiovascular disease. But we routinely use NRT, patches and gum, and so on and so forth, in people with cardiovascular disease, even that are acutely unwell. So it's not uncommon these days after your myocardial infarction to have patches on within the first few days. In pregnancy, we know from animal studies again that nicotine is not harmless. And again, we take a harm reduction approach typically with pregnant women using NRT. Different countries have different levels of comfort, I think, in using nicotine replacement therapy in pregnant women. But in general, if someone can't stop smoking, they'd be better off using a clean delivery system. In terms of adolescence, nicotine's not great for the developing adolescent brain, nor is cannabis for that matter, or a number of other things like alcohol. But there's a lot of concern around this, and I think, again, adolescents who don't smoke should not vape. In terms of cell studies, and there are an increasing number of studies looking at cell lines or animal studies, and nearly all of them show the same thing. And that is that compared with breathing fresh air or having fresh air washing over cells, vaping either the aerosol itself or the liquid causes some harm. But in general, that harm is less than if you expose those cells or animals to smoke. So it's a continuum of risk. And sort of trying to work out exactly where we fall with the level of harm is a little bit tricky. But as this review in the European Respiratory Journal said, that look, even if we know that there are some signals of harm, we probably won't see any harm in adult vapors for some time yet. You all know that we talk about if you stop smoking before the age of 35, then your chances of dying from a smoking-related disease are the same as a non-smoker. So it's all related to exposure, and that's, I think, quite important. In terms of exposure and toxicants in humans, there are again accumulating data. This is some data from a study we undertook in London, which this was a non-randomized controlled trial, but we switched people to an e-cigarette and we followed them up for 4 weeks in this case, and we looked at a number of toxicants. So we've got acrolein, which is a carcinogen, carbon monoxide, which you get from burning, of course, the organic material, and cotinine, which is just the primary metabolite of nicotine. Now you can see there, in those that completely switched from smoking to electronic cigarette use, both in this carbon monoxide and the acrolein, you see a large, significant decline in exposure. But even in those people who were still dual using, they were still smoking whilst using an e-cigarette, they too had a reduction in exposure. Ideally, you'd get them to get them off smoking completely. But it does give, again, this indication of a gradient. Others, Maciej Gonowitz has looked at this as well by looking at a number of toxicants that you can measure in urine by exclusive e-cigarette user versus dual user versus exclusive smoker versus never user of any of those things. And what you're seeing here is that some things, such as exposure to NNK, are really low when you switch to e-cigarettes, very similar to no use of any tobacco products or e-cigarette. But if you look at lead there on that screen, you can see less of a difference. So depending on what you're looking at. And I think here we've got to remember that harm's related to exposure. We might find these toxicants, but that just the presence of toxicants doesn't mean that there's going to be harm. Just going out in the sun for 5 minutes, of course, doesn't mean much, and it's indeed a good thing, but you spend more time lying on Bondi Beach, maybe not today, then you're going to increase harm. And again, just looking at some other, these are self-reported respiratory symptoms here, only in a cross-sectional survey, but again shows that same picture. Compared to a non-user, a current vapor has a high likelihood of reporting wheezing or whistling in their chest, but less than a current smoker or a dual user. And if you break it down, if you just look at the right-hand side there, this is looking at an ex-smoker who doesn't vape versus an ex-smoker who does vape, and you still see that increase in symptoms. Of course, these are cross-sectional data. It may be that those ex-smokers that managed to stop smoking without vaping were your healthier smokers than those that didn't. What about uptake in young people? Are young people becoming addicted to vaping products? Is this a concern? Well, it appears to be, depending on where you are. So data from the UK first, and this is over time with the most recent data up at the top of the screen. And you can still see there most people have never used most young people have never used an e-cigarette. But you can see that regular use has increased over time. But what you really want to know is who is it that's using them? Are they young never smokers, or are they young smokers? And actually, when you look at regular use, it's concentrated in people who are current smokers. So regular use from these data in never smokers is tiny. You're looking at, 0.1% there. Okay, this is in the UK. New Zealand, we've got data from our Year 10 survey. So Year 10 students. Again, if you look down the bottom at vaping by smoking status, then regular vaping, regular e-cigarette use is more common in young people who are smoking than it is in never smokers. So for these data, 0.4% of never smokers are using e-cigarettes daily. And actually, it's a similar pattern in the US. Again, if you're looking at vaping for 20 plus days of a month, you can see in 2018, then 1% were vaping. And over time, and this is about, just looking at the gateway effect here, over time you're seeing this continual decline in smoked tobacco. So smoking rates are continuing to decline even though the rates of experimentation and regular use are increasing. So it doesn't seem that we've got a gateway effect on our hands just at the moment, but it's always difficult to tell for sure. And I'm nearly finished, but just on flavours. Flavours are important for adults who smoke who want to switch. I'm just going to go back to our randomised controlled trial that we published in the New England Journal of Medicine this year, where we gave people randomised to the e-cigarette arm a bottle of tobacco-flavoured e-liquid. That's all they got, actually. It's just a sample they were sent off to get their own. Over time, people switched. And actually, at the end of the trial, it was fruit-flavoured liquids that were the most popular among people who had switched. So for adults, different flavours are important, and so we have to balance the risks of young people being attracted to some of these flavours against the benefits of maybe helping people who smoke to quit. So I think there are likely to be some adverse health effects of long-term or associated with long-term vaping. So concerns warranted here. But I think we do need to balance this concern with the concerns in health and well-being of people who continue to smoke, especially for those people that have tried everything under the sun to try and help them quit. I think remember too that smoking cessation, so complete abstinence from smoked tobacco, is the best way to achieve the full health benefits. And although switching to vaping may potentially reduce those gains, at the moment it's suggesting that they are still less harmful than smoked tobacco. However, I think to mitigate any potential concerns about long-term health harm, simply advising people who vape to aim to stop vaping completely as soon as they feel safe that they won't relapse to smoking. And moving forward, and we still don't have regulation in New Zealand yet. I'm forever hopeful it's coming soon, but that's been my wish for the last 3 to 5 years. But we can take some appropriate steps. We've seen in the EU that this is possible. And really about limiting uptake in young never smokers is important. But also so is making sure that public have accurate messages around vaping, not just about vaping and who it's for, but also what we've seen in the US. We need to be quite truthful about this and encourage people not to buy black market vaping products. It's difficult to regulate against the black market, as you all know. We will have emerging health effects as we know more and learn more, and our legislation needs to be flexible enough to add in the new things as we know more. Simply having a register of a notification scheme of all products that are available on the market would be a jolly good start. So if you knew if something went wrong, which ones that you'd want to pull. And commissioning some good monitoring. We should all be looking at vaping use in our primary care and hospital databases. Putting it down as smoking is not the right thing to do. How are we ever going to find out what the health risks are if we just lump it all into the same boat? So we need to be a little bit more considerate here and making sure we've got a good system in place for adverse events, just as we've seen in the US. And I'll finish it there. Thanks very much.
Any quick questions? Maybe we'll see how we go towards the end, because so I'd like to introduce Rebecca McKetin, who will be talking on novel interventions to address methamphetamine use in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and the development and evaluation of web-based therapeutic tool. Rebecca is over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal people, and their elders past, present and future. So today the work that I'll be talking about comes from the NIMAC project. NIMAC stands for Novel Interventions to Address Methamphetamine Use in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Communities. I've put the website there nice and big so you can go and have a look, and I'd encourage you to do that. So this is a project which is a multi-institutional project, and it's being led by SAMRI. Particularly James Ward is the lead investigator. You can see him up there in the top left corner. So I'd just like to acknowledge many of the people, the other investigators on this NH and MRC project. So how did this project come about? Well, it was conceived of back in probably 2014, 2015. And you might remember then that there were a number of inquiries into ice use in Australia and different states and territories, also the National Ice Task Force. In fact, they're still going on as it happens. And this is a quote from someone from the Victorian inquiry, and it was very typical of the types of things that I was hearing about from Mr. Sloan, who's an Indigenous advocate from Shepparton in Victoria. And this is a transcript. The ice use itself is a major problem in our community, but it's a flow-on effects. It affects the families, affects relationships, affects employment, it affects the driving. It affects all of that. It's just rife through the community. Now, when you talk to people, it's not affecting every single Aboriginal community in Australia, but those that are affected very badly. The problem is, and I experienced this as someone who worked in the field, people were ringing me up going, and actually when we first got this resurgence of ice use, it was people from Aboriginal communities that were ringing up going, there's something going on here. But there's actually not much data that we had to understand what was going on. If you look at the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, and this was the one prior to when we put the grant in, what you could say is that methamphetamine use was higher amongst Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people than it was amongst non-Indigenous Australians. But if you imagine a drug with a prevalence of, I think it's 1.4% in the past year, and then you've got only a few percent of Australians who identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, you're looking at a very small number of people. So firstly, how reliable is that data? But second, what can you get out of that? You're probably looking at a couple of people in the survey who said that, yes, they've used in the past year. The only other data that we had was a survey by James that he'd recently done of young Aboriginal people, almost 3,000 people. Now, this was a survey about other risk behaviours, but in the context of that, he asked about meth use. And he found that 9% of people had used in the past year. So that gave him an idea that this is actually potentially a real issue amongst his communities. At the same time, there was clearly a recognised need to support Aboriginal communities in dealing with this problem. And when I went to speak at conferences and I presented what we knew about treatment, people from Aboriginal communities would put up their hand and say, but these interventions are not for us. They're, for white people. So what do you want us to do? So it was in this, the context of this environment that we conceived of this project. And the basic principle is to try and provide some evidence about what is happening in Aboriginal communities in terms of meth use, and also to start to build an evidence base about how we can intervene. One of the really nice things about working with James Ward is that he has very good links with the Aboriginal communities, and you can see here that we're working with 10 different communities around Australia, Darwin, over in Carnarvon, northern WA, Brisbane, and quite a few in South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales. I'd just like to acknowledge the nice Indigenous InStyle who did this beautiful map. So NIMAC's quite a big project, and we're working with these communities to come up with different research strategies to better inform responses to ice in these communities. And the first one is a survey. We wanted to survey consumers to find out about patterns of use, context of use, harms, that type of thing. We've just finished that survey and we're in the process of starting to publish the results. There are data on 734 people who use methamphetamine currently. This is arguably one of the largest surveys ever done of people who use methamphetamine. And 59% of those are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, so it's by a long way the largest survey of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are using methamphetamine. The second component is qualitative research with communities to understand the impact it's having on them and the types of things that are going on from their perspective. And then thirdly, community-led interventions, which are actually Aboriginal communities coming up with their own ways of dealing with this problem, whether it's yarning groups or other things. And the fourth thing is actually the one that I'm going to focus on today. And this is, aside from the survey, this is the aspect of this project which I'm most involved with. And it's an online tool. And you might say, well, why are you doing an online tool with Aboriginal communities? It sounds a bit weird. Well, James came to me and he goes, the Aboriginal medical services want something that they can use when people approach them with problems. And we're looking at all the different options, and we didn't have a lot. And we just happened, and I'll show you later, we were developing some online tools. And we thought this might be a way of engaging with people because of the stigma and the shame associated with use, a lot of them weren't coming into the services. So just wanted to acknowledge that I've been working very closely with both James and also Rachel Riley, who's a psychologist, on the development of this intervention. And this is the background tool that we previously developed with Francis K. Lampkin and Robert Tate. We come up with an online tool called Breaking the Ice, and we've done an RCT of that. It's kind of a lot of motivational interviewing tools, a little bit of CBT, and what we found was we didn't get a reduction in stimulant use, but what it did do, which was quite useful, is it increased help seeking. And help seeking is quite hard to change. So it also increased motivation to reduce use, or what we call readiness to change. So we've decided that this might be a good way of motivating people to get in touch with services and seek help for their substance use. So rather than talk about it, I'll show you what we've actually done. Now this is the tricky bit where I need you to all hold your breath while I try and get this to work. This is the introduction to Breaking the Ice. I mean, not Breaking the Ice, the We Can Do It tool.
Do you use methamphetamines, also known as ice? I know someone that does. Have you noticed it's become a problem lately?
Yes.
We are here to help. We Can Do This is an online program to help people reduce ice use and to help users engage with health services. It's been designed by Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal doctors, Aboriginal community members and people who have used ice before. It's private, free and easy to use. You just need a mobile phone, computer or tablet and an internet connection. You can use it by yourself or with the help from a counsellor. We are currently looking for people to test the We Can Do This program as part of a research study. So if you reckon you're ready to let go of ice, come and get involved. We've got your back. By working together, we can do this.
And one of the things we found with our previous interventions is that they're quite, we got a lot of feedback that they're very text heavy and they're hard to engage with. And we didn't want that with this particular intervention. So what we've done is we've actually got stories from people who are using methamphetamine as part of the survey. We did in-depth interviews with them. We took the transcripts of their story and we got Aboriginal actors to play out those stories, and we fitted them within the intervention to be more realistic. Okay, so you can actually see when you go through this, it asks you about the good things about ice, and before this it gives you an example from, this is Tanisha's story, and this is one of the narratives that came from one of our participants. It's important to emphasise the good things.
When I first tried it, I used to have a stereo in my car, and I was sitting there and just listening to the music, and then I could feel the music going straight through me, you know. And I just thought that was one of the best feelings I ever had, of that music was going right through me, and I could just feel it rattling all the way through me, and I just forgot about everything, and I just thought that was one of the best feelings I ever had, you know. And I just thought, oh yeah, I'll just sit here and do this every weekend, you know, just to keep that feeling going.
So that's an example of why people use ice, and so then you go through when you do the exercises where you say, how true is this for me, it feels good, and you put on a bar how important that is for you. And when you get to the end, you get a list of things that are important to you in terms of yeah, it feels good is very important to me and the other things are less important. And this is all part of a decision-making tool. And then you go through the bad things. I won't show you Josh's story, but you do the same thing again. And when you get to the end, you get a good and a bad, weighing it up. So this is essentially what we've done in our previous intervention. It's very basic. It's part of a decision-making tool. You can put your own reasons in there. I haven't got any bad things, so it's not working very well. But normally, I'll show you in a minute on the PowerPoint presentation, you get a weighing up of good and bad things. But there are other options. So if you go back to home, you can look at all of the other things, which are standard CBT type motivational interviewing interventions, how to manage slip-ups. And again, Tanisha's got a story about that, which makes it a lot more engaging than listening to a clinician.
Yeah, I actually had stopped using, you know, just a few weeks, just before my dad died. Yeah, I had the viewing and then I had the funeral like the next day. And I don't know, it wasn't until that night that I even touched it, you know. I had a big argument with my boyfriend because he was supposed to watch my little brother on the day of the funeral, but he had like, I don't know, like half a gram with him, and I just looked at it and I looked at him and then, I don't know, like I just started crying because I guess I just wanted to take the pain away. But yeah, so I think I don't know, that lapse was just because of my dad and all that. Like, yeah, I felt bad afterwards, but it was just too easy. And, you know, in times like that, it always is. And yeah, sometimes it's like the slightest little things that can fuck things up, and people will be like judging you because you had a habit and I don't know, like all this stuff. And, you know, it's hard to get out of. Like, it's very hard, you know. And yeah, I don't know when I can definitely say I'll be over it, but I don't know. Like, if I put myself around anybody that does it or be around like anybody, then I'll want to use. And or if I don't want to use, they'll be all like, oh, you know, what's wrong with you? And if I don't want to use, then I'd have to leave the house because like, I don't want to use. But I don't know, yeah.
So you can see how having these narratives throughout the whole story, and there's 4 different characters, it kind of makes it a little bit more, it's much more engaging. It's the thing that most people go straight to are the stories and they listen to them. In addition, we've got audio, so people don't actually have to read the text if they don't want to. And if we go back to the PowerPoint presentation, I'll just show you the example I was talking about before. So you, like for the motivational interviewing things, it prioritises good and bad things, and then people get to make decisions about what they want to change, what they want to focus on. So hopefully we'll have finalised this by next year, and we've written up a protocol to do a randomised controlled trial of this in communities. And our main, like I said before, we'll be looking at recruiting online, and the idea is to funnel people in to connect them with services. It's a 3-month intervention where we assess people every month, and we have a waitlist control group. So those people who are in the waitlist control will get the intervention after 3 months, so they don't have to wait very long. And during that time, they can interact with the local services. Our outcomes, I think, importantly, are feasibility, because we haven't tried to do this before, and also acceptability. We've got methamphetamine use as our main primary outcome measure in the traditional sense of an RCT, but I think that's quite ambitious. And I think what I would hope to see is probably primarily increased referral to services, increased service contact, and we also have a range of other things that we'll be looking at. We ask people specific questions about usability of the intervention as well, and get feedback on that. And again, there's my contact details if you want to get in touch. There's the website for NIMAC, and hopefully in not too long you'll be able to go on there and look at the intervention without having to wait for all the technical glitches to be fixed. Thank you.
Any quick question for Rebecca? Yes, it is getting that time of the day, isn't it? Okay, thanks. We may have time at the end. So the last but not least, Professor Don Weatherburn, ex of the Director of Bureau of Crime Statistics, now Professor here at NDARC. We welcome him to talk on do criminal sanctions deter ATS use. Over to you, Don.
You're still here. That's great. I had this picture of myself talking to an empty room. Not that it would be the first time I've ever spoken in an empty room. The worst time was when I was speaking to about 3,000 sheep at Bathurst, but that's a long time ago. So, good. I thought if I can get a few laughs, I'll know who's awake and who's not. So, Rebecca, thanks for having such a complex presentation. I'm not going to do that. I'm only using PowerPoint and then only to a limited extent. So, the first question is, how do I get my slides up? Is there a trick to that? Here he comes to rescue me. So I thought I should give you a bit of background. I know not many of you realise how dangerous methamphetamine is, but have you got it? Okay, some police in the southern states are worried in the US about people flushing their methamphetamine down the toilet for fear that it might create meth gators. I thought that was more interesting than just putting a whole bunch of stats up there to tell you that it's dangerous. But anyway, we'll get serious about this. 2 months ago, just in case you needed any advice to this effect, New South Wales managed a big seizure of methamphetamine. It's a problem in lots of places, and jokes aside, it's having a big effect on law enforcement and public health. The number of people arrested for use and possess methamphetamine's gone up by a factor of 4, the rate I should say, since 2009. The number of people with psychotic disorders across Australia due to methamphetamine use, or the rate has gone up by a factor of 7. And the number of people turning up in the emergency departments of New South Wales hospitals with methamphetamine use as the problem has gone up by a factor of 11. So these are really big changes, much more rapid changes than the corresponding growth in heroin dependence back in the 1990s. As Rebecca said, it's a huge problem in Aboriginal communities, and unlike heroin, when that was at its peak, primarily an urban phenomenon, we've got big problems in places like Moree. It's wreaking havoc in those towns, and it's really important that we do something to address it. So the criminal justice system is hard at work arresting people and fining them. The most common response to somebody arrested in New South Wales for use and possession of methamphetamine is to give them a bond. About 24% get a bond, and about 63% get a fine. And these sanctions do vary in severity. First of all, anybody who gets a bond or a fine for use and possession of methamphetamine ends up with a criminal conviction. And a criminal conviction, in case you're not well aware of this, substantially reduces your subsequent chances of employment and your earnings prospects. But I'll come back to that point later on. So fines vary greatly in severity. The average fine's about $420, but the median's $400. And the standard deviation's $268, and fines range up to $5,380. The significant thing about a fine is that a lot of people who get fined don't pay their fine. If they don't pay their fine, they have their licence disqualified. If they have their licence disqualified, they often end up driving without a licence, and that's a surefire way of ending up in jail. So in many respects, starting out with a use-possess conviction ends up generating a jail sentence for what amounts, I think most people would agree, as a fairly minor offence. But bonds that don't get much attention are also important. About half the people who get picked up and convicted of methamphetamine possession end up with a bond without supervision, which is really nothing more than an injunction to be of good behaviour. There are no strings attached to that. If you do breach the conditions of your bond, you can be brought up before a court and resentenced for the original offence. But a bond with supervision is quite a different kettle of fish. You get conditions applying, there are requirements for regular reporting, there are restrictions on movement, or there's a possibility of that, and there's coerced treatment. So the sanctions are not minor. They may not involve jail. Jail's a very rare penalty to impose on somebody whose only offence is use and possession of methamphetamine, or any other drug for that matter. The key question, though, is that this is what we've been doing for years and years, and you might think there's a long history of research trying to examine the effectiveness of these sanctions in deterring use. But you'd be surprised to discover there's absolutely no research at all, and it wasn't till Mike welcomed me to NDARC that I thought I might have a look at this problem. And it's interesting to see that we know very little about this problem. We've known for a long time, economists have established for a long time, that criminal conviction reduces an individual's employment and earnings prospects. We know that mandatory minimum fines do sometimes work in deterring behaviour. Wagoner and L in 2007 found evidence that high fines reduce the risk of drink driving. We repeated the study with my colleague Steve Moffat and found no effect. And we also know that drug offenders who are placed on probation are less likely to reoffend than those placed on prison. But for the most part, most of the research on the criminal justice, the effect of the criminal justice system on substance use is focused solely on prison, which is not where most people who are convicted of drug use and possession end up, or at least not immediately. So we had two aims in doing this study. I'm working with my colleague Steve Yong at the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. One of them was whether correctional supervision reduces the risk of another amphetamine use possession offence. Second one is whether or not it reduces the risk of any other drug offence. We also wanted to know whether high fines had the same effect. In other words, whether high fines reduce the risk of another drug offence or another use-possessed amphetamine offence. How are we travelling? Everybody okay? This won't be a long talk. You can relax. Okay, so let's start with the supervision story. The data comes from ROD, the reoffending database that's maintained by the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. We're dealing with about 2,255 people who were convicted of use and possession of amphetamine between 1994 and 2017. About 1,000 of them got a bond with supervision and about 1,200 of them got a bond without supervision. And the outcomes are reconviction, either reconviction for a further drug offence within 48 months free time. And free time, by the way, means time spent out of custody. So we're able to subtract that time so that they're all equally exposed to committing another offence. And of course, we're also interested in what the likelihood is of being arrested for another use-possessed amphetamine offence. So the method we're using is augmented inverse probability of treatment weighting, which I'm led to believe drug and alcohol researchers know backwards. Who knows it backwards? Go on, admit it. Okay, just in case you don't know what it is, basically take this for granted. It's a form of outcome regression with a model for treatment exposure. And the nice thing about this is that either the treatment exposure model or the outcome model needs to be correct, and you've got a credible estimate of the effect of the treatment. So that's a nice, doubly robust feature of the technique. So the controls we have are quite substantial. For the demographics, we've got age, sex, Indigenous status, area, that is to say remoteness and socioeconomic status. For the index court appearance, that's the court appearance where they actually get the penalty imposed. We've got the number of concurrent offences, that is offences other than the use-possessed amphetamine offence, and we've got the number of counts of the principal offence. The prior criminal justice contexts are the most important because they have a huge effect on the subsequent risk of reoffending. So we've got age at first criminal justice contact. That's really important because the earlier your first conviction, the more likely it is you'll have a long criminal career. We've got whether they've been previously convicted of a drug offence and the number of prior convictions. And we've got some exposure controls, plea and legal representation, which affect the likelihood of getting a supervised bond versus an unsupervised bond. So, just a bit of descriptive stuff here. Most of them are male, about 1 in 5 are female, about 82% are non-Indigenous, but Indigenous people are, as you'd expect, overrepresented in this offence, as with so many others. Most of the people in this sample are coming from major cities rather than from regional New South Wales. Interesting thing about this compared with heroin is that the socioeconomic status, as judged by the area in which the defendants live, is fairly evenly spread across the CFA strata. Most of them have only one offence, so they're turning up with just that use and possession of amphetamine offence. A few of them have concurrent offences. Most of them don't have a prior drug offence in the preceding 5 years, but the prior criminal record is fairly split. So you've got a bimodal distribution with about a third of them having no prior convictions and about a third having 4+ prior convictions. They nearly always plead guilty because it's hard to argue the toss if you've been picked up with a drug in your possession. About 50% of them are legally represented, the other half aren't. About 91% don't have another use possession offence in the next 4 years free time, and about 81% don't have a new drug offence. The only other thing to say is that the average age is 31, but the age of first contact with the criminal justice system's 25. You can see the profile of these people is that they don't have a substantial history of contact with the justice system, and they don't go on to have a substantial history of contact with the criminal justice system. So let's move on now to a couple of issues to do with the diagnostics. When we do this sort of treatment, we want two things we really want to happen. We want some overlap in what's called the propensity score distribution. That's just a fancy word for the probability of ending up in the treatment group, regardless of whether you actually did or you didn't. So we want some overlap between the likelihood of ending up in treatment for the group that didn't get treatment and the likelihood of ending up in treatment for the group that did get treatment. And the reason we want that is we're trying to get people who are equally likely to end up in that group and compare their outcomes. This is really what we're trying to do here, matching them on their observables so that they're all exactly the same except for the fact that one ended up in treatment. So we can't do augmented inverse probability of treatment weighting if any variables predicts with certainty what group you're going to end up in. So here's the overlap with the propensity score distributions. You can say that's absolutely beautiful. That's what you're hoping. Isn't that great? Don't you think that's good? Say yes, Don. Yes, Don, thanks. All right. So that's all good. That means we've got plenty of people who could have gone either way. Here's the covariate balance. Just look at the weighted column for differences. We want that to be 0 after we've weighted them, and you can see all those numbers for each of the controls is very close to 0, which is just nice. And we want the weighted variance estimates to be all close to 1, and you can see they're all close to 1. And you want to run a statistical test that tells you you're on the money, and lo and behold, it did. Our covariates are balanced. So essentially what we've got here is two groups which, so far as we can tell, are identical in all respects except for the fact that one went off and got supervision and the other one didn't. So what are the results? Well, about 21% of those who got an unsupervised bond ended up with a further conviction for a new drug offence. We'd like to think that if they got supervision, that risk would drop, but it didn't. You can see that the effect of supervision is tiny, it's positive instead of negative, and the result is it's non-significant. So there is no evidence in this analysis that placing a person under supervision who's been convicted of use and possession of methamphetamine makes any difference at all to the likelihood of another drug offence. What about another use possess amphetamine offence? Well, it's basically the same story. The risk of reoffending is about 8%, but as you can see, there's very little difference. Really, that should have been positive. That 0.16 should have been minus 0.16, some tiny improvement, but there's no improvement at all, and there's no significant effect. So it doesn't look as if putting these people under supervision is having any effect whatsoever, either on their risk of being arrested or convicted for another use possess amphetamine offence, or the risk of being arrested and convicted of another drug offence. So let's turn our minds to fines. How are you travelling? About 10 minutes to go. All right, so the source of data is the rod again. We've got 9,000 people this time. You already know that, and the outcomes are the same, and the controls are much the same, except we've got some month by year fixed effects and regional control. The problem here, though, is what about endogeneity? Some of you may have been wondering why I didn't bring that up in the first part of it. Some of you may be wondering what the hell endogeneity is. Who's ever heard of it? I'm going to explain it in the nicest possible way. So, the thing is that fines may reduce the risk of reoffending, but those with a high risk of reoffending are more likely to get a high fine. So the causal process runs both ways. And here's my best attempt at an exciting graphic. So in comes the fine amount and knocks the risk. You can laugh. I really wanted the two to come in. And then in comes the risk of reoffending and knocks the fine amount around. If someone knows out there how to get these two things to come in and collide and bounce off one another, I'd be so happy. I spent hours on that slide. All right, so what's the two-stage least square solution? Well, basically, you find a factor which is the economists would call an instrument that influences treatment which has no effect on risk of reoffending other than through treatment. And then what you do is you regress that treatment intensity, which in our case is the fine amount, against the instrument plus controls. That's in the first stage. And then in the second stage, you regress your risk of reoffending against the predicted treatment intensity plus controls. And now by construction, the independent variables have been purged of their correlation with the error term. Now, if you thought that was hard, just wait till you see this. So I'm going to walk you through this because I think you need to know it. I haven't seen enough of this in public health research. So you start off, the log of the fine amount, that's individual I facing Judge J. I'll tell you a bit more about Judge J in a second, at time t. That's our instrument, that's our measure which has no effect on reoffending except through the fine amount. That's really important. There's our controls, there's our month-year fixed effect, and there's the error term. Don't worry about all that stuff. The crucial thing here, though, is that what we're going to do is we've got this variable called our instrument, and we're going to find a movement of variation in the fine amount, which is by construction limited to situations where there's no direct effect on reoffending. What we then do is we plug in that. There, it's all making sense now? And we're away. So that's what we did. So how do we get the instrument? Well, the instrument, the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research managed to get the identity of every judge. They don't seem to realise this. So what we did was as an instrument, we had the average fine imposed in all cases other than the one the magistrate's dealing with. So we know what fine every magistrate imposes on a person who gets picked up and convicted of use and possession of methamphetamine. So in a sense, you know how nasty they are. So we take this person here and we say, how tough is this judge? Well, we'll have a look at all the other cases that judge has dealt with. You with me? And this, of course, is a variation which has no direct effect on reoffending except through the fine amount itself. It's just fantastic. Anyway, the second instrument we use is even better than that. What we do is we regress the first instrument against the controls and the fixed effects, and we take what's left over as our instrument. So basically what we're doing here is we're taking this judicial disparity and we're ripping out any part of it that's associated with the covariates so that all we've got left here is variation that reflects the judge punitiveness. I can't do a better job than that of explaining it, so I hope it makes sense. So along the bottom here you've got how nasty the magistrate is, and the diagonal line, you show the distribution. They do vary a lot in their willingness to impose a fine. This is the residualised instrument, by the way, so it's been purged of any association with those covariates, and you can see there's quite a bit of variation. So the first thing we want is that we want our instrument to be not associated with any of our controls, and it looks good there. There's one of them, age at first contact, which is there, but you know, if you keep on doing stats tests, you all know about Bonferroni, you'll end up finding one of them significant. There's a few more there, but the crucial thing is if you look at the F statistic for our instrument, it's not statistically significant, so it looks like a good instrument. So basically, in plain English, what we're trying to do here is exploit judicial disparity to find out what effect a high fine has on your risk of another drug offence. Is that reasonably clear? Okay, so here are the results. You know, I learnt this from economists. You never present one model if you can present 10. So the only one we really care about, my colleague Steve insisted I provide all of this, but the only one we really care about is the continuous one. But just so you know what we're talking about, the OLS one is just running an ordinary least squares regression, pretending that endogeneity is not a problem. The binary one, we split the fine amounts in the middle and just ask the question, are you in the top or the bottom category of fine? The node transform, we just didn't transform anything. Oh, you don't really want to know all the other stuff, do you? Don't. Okay, so the bottom line of this, just look at that top row. So you can see that the risk of any drug offence within 48 months, if you have a 10% increase in the fine amount, 10% increase in the fine amount, what do you get out of it? A 0.46% drop in the risk of reoffending. That is absolutely tiny. It's significant, I grant you, but it's very small. And the same, they all show basically the same result. You can see there's a negative coefficient, which is exactly what you want. If you move down to the use possess amphetamines outcome, nothing is significant. So it doesn't matter if you increase the fine. It's having no effect at all on the risk of reoffending, whether you're talking about a new drug offence or a new use possess offence. So I think it's fairly clear that what the criminal justice system is throwing at people who are convicted of use possess amphetamine is not working in terms of reducing the risk of any further offending. So let me just try to summarise where we're at. Supervision doesn't appear to have any effect on the risk of another amphetamine use possession offence. High fines don't seem to have much effect. If they have any effect at all, it's extremely weak. The most frequently used sanctions, in other words, are relatively ineffective. There are some caveats. Before I get to the caveats, I should say the trouble with the high fines, if you're one of those people that gets very excited about the fact that a 10% increase in the fine produces a 0.46% reduction in reoffending, is, as I said earlier, high fines often don't get paid. If they don't pay them, they have their licence disqualified. If they have their licence disqualified and they drive while they're disqualified, they often end up in jail. Oh, please don't photograph me. No, gee, that worked. Doesn't usually work. Okay, on with the job. Caveats. The augmented inverse probability of treatment weighting technique assumes that there are no unobserved effects. In other words, you're basically assuming that the allocation to treatment and control is random, conditional on the covariates that went into the model. The two-stage least squares assumes exogeneity of the instrument, means that it's being driven by factors outside the model, and the findings don't address the issue of general deterrence. For my own part, just looking at the general literature, the argument that the general public is going to be more deterred by a conviction than by a caution is pretty hard to sustain. What's the conclusion? Well, to me, just on the evidence gathered so far, there's no obvious benefit placing non-dependent people, amphetamine